I see there being basically two different tracks of theology between the East and the West, and that it's not just an issue of the papacy. It's not just an issue of do we recognize the primacy of the Bishop of Rome, but actually that we get two different streams of thought that I believe go back to theology. So for me, it's not just a juridical issue of jurisdiction, of does this bishop have supremacy over here, but actually a question of what is the theological assumption or presupposition that would even lead to that kind of an idea. So for us, it's a divergence on the Trinity itself.
Right.
So this is where the filioque comes in. It's not the only issue, actually. In our view, the filioque is kind of a logical conclusion of other theological views, and the most important of which, where we diverge, would be what's called absolute divine simplicity.
Right.
And in the Roman Catholic view, and I've got my Denzinger and my Thomas Aquinas here, they're very specific about the radical nature of this claim and this view in Roman dogma. So it's not just an opinion, it's not just a debated thing, it's actually a dogmatic position that essentially the starting point for Roman Catholic theology in terms of God is that there's one essence that is absolutely simple, without any real distinctions or differentiations within that essence. And so this leads then to theologians like Augustine or Aquinas proposing that the way we distinguish the persons in God is through what's called relations of opposition. And there's a lot of problems with that view that we can get into later. But essentially what happens is that God is approached as a kind of essence or a kind of thing first. It's like God is the highest level of super essence that exists in the world. Everything has being, and then there's kind of like a super being that has an analogy to God. So this is very common in medieval scholastics. It's very common in Aquinas, sometimes called the analogy of being or the analogia entis. Now, all of that to say that this scheme, this system, then results in a whole bunch of different views, not just about God, but also it affects the ecclesiology, the doctrine of the church. It also affects the social order and the relationship of church and state between pope and emperor or bishop and emperor. It goes on to reflect the notions of sociology, I would say, as many Orthodox theologians have argued that the social order itself gets caught up in dialectics. And this is the dialectics that were introduced by Augustine and by Origen and other theologians that maybe meant well, but the philosophical presuppositions from which they came, trying to use Hellenism, trying to use and import ideas from the Greek philosophers to where we could start with God not as personal, not as he, and not have a direct connection to God through our nous or to seeing God face to face, but rather through created analogies, through created beings. So in other words, to sum up, my theological issue, and we can talk about the Pope and we can talk about the Bible text and all that in a bit. We can talk about the schism and the different councils. But my main theological problem is that this scheme, what I finally came to believe as a Roman Catholic, was that this scheme kind of puts a wall ultimately between us and a direct deification or theosis with God. We have to then approach God through a bunch of created graces, created analogies, and created forms, and never, ever a direct connection to God until the beatific vision in the afterlife. But as St. Gregory Palamas said to his Western opponent in the debate with Barlaam, if this is the case, this seems to lead ultimately to atheism, because you never directly know God. You only know a bunch of created effects. And if you only know a bunch of created effects in time and space, then really you're just interacting with a supposed first cause. And if you're just interacting with a generic supposed first cause, then it kind of leads to perennialism, or the Masonic idea that we don't know one specific God who is the Father, who generates the Son, inspires the Spirit, but we know something that's like a generic theism that we can kind of paste any kind of God onto. And so my final conclusion is that is the end result of Vatican II. That's why the documents like Lumen Gentium, Nostra Aetate, why those documents in Vatican II actually propose that you don't need Christ, that it's okay to be Jewish, it's okay to be Islamic. That theology can still save you precisely because it's the outworking of a long train of rejecting a specific direct connection with God, theosis, or hesychia, as it's called in the East, and replacing it with these kind of created forms, juridical forms, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot more to that, but that's my initial opening statement.
Right. Well, I certainly think that's interesting. And admittedly, I'm not as well versed on the philosophy aspects of it as you are. In studying for this debate and reading up on scholasticism and on really the technical nature of the philosophy of our religion, I understand there's a lot that I don't know. I've only come around to really an interest in the religious aspects into Catholicism in particular pretty recently. But I always go back to, and we can go back and forth on divine simplicity, and we can talk about the nature of the Trinity and all these things. I think where I come from fundamentally, I think that's an interesting debate. I think that's something we could talk about. But I think when we get down to it, it really comes down to what is in the Scripture, which is to say that the Roman Church, the Latin Church, the Catholic Church has Peter. And I really find it hard to say that you can be an Eastern Orthodox person, that you could still be a Christian, when there's so much in the Scripture which says that you have St. Peter and the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, as supreme over the other bishops. And so I think when you look at that, I mean, it could be an interesting thing that we could go down that avenue, and we could say that does divine simplicity, because you don't have that personal relationship with God, you don't have that theosis, could that lead to, in some way, shape, or form, secularism or atheism? I think that's an interesting tract, but I think it gets away from the fundamental point, point there in Catholicism, which is that Peter was given the keys. Peter was given the keys. He was the rock on which the church was founded. And I don't see how you could be a Christian. I don't know how that would be not heretical if your church does not include that first church and Rome in particular. So I know that's not, I don't use all the technical language. I know, and I respect your knowledge greatly, but that's really where I come at it from.
Okay, well, two things I would say to that is that one, reply to the issue of the claim that, well, if I go to the Bible, I can find these Petrine texts, and that therefore this kind of vindicates the totality of Roman Catholicism. One problem with that is that a lot of times, now you may not be making this argument, but I made this argument as a Roman Catholic apologist, and many Roman Catholic apologists still make this argument. They will say that the only way that we know what the Bible is ultimately because some councils, but ultimately Rome made the decision of what the canon of Scripture would be. This is a very common Catholic argument, and I don't deny that there's an aspect to which absolutely the church in time confirmed what the canon would be. I would deny that it was completely the decision of Rome, but it's very often made clear by Roman Catholic apologists that the papacy confirms the Scriptures. So, but what I'm hearing is that at the same time, the Roman Catholic apologists will say the papacy confirms the Scriptures, but to prove the papacy, I can go to the Scriptures and find a few verses here and there. And that therefore I can extrapolate the universal jurisdiction, both spiritual and temporal, of a Pontifex Maximus universal monarch for the office of Peter, a bishop in the early church. To me, that's very strained and circular. Now, I do believe that ultimately we can talk about questions of ultimate presuppositions or worldview beliefs being circular, because at a certain point you're gonna hit the highest authority and it's going to be circular. But the problem is that in Roman Catholic theology and epistemology, they have a view that's called classical foundationalism. Now, this is a term that's given later in time, but it's essentially the idea that you can't have circular arguments. You have to have a kind of a foundation, and then a self-evident maxim, and then you kind of build on that, and then you build on that, and then you build on that. So for most Catholic theologians, it's been things like the law of non-contradiction, or this kind of thing. A equals A, modus ponens. These are self-evident maxims, and then we can build our system on top of that. So what I'm saying is that the problem with that view, Nick, is that there's you can't on the one hand have the Pope being the reason that we know what books make up the canon, and at the same time going to the canon of Scripture and saying that this is what justifies the universal jurisdiction of the Bishop of Rome. So, and one other point to your argument is that Peter was in Antioch, and so if I attend an Antiochian Orthodox church, that descends from Peter. Mm-hmm. So in other words, there's not in our position, there's not any specific reason why Rome has a universal jurisdictional primacy beyond it just having a lot of honor. And in fact, when you read the ecumenical councils, we would absolutely agree with the Petrine see being given primacy in terms of what's called Peter was called the coryphaeus of the apostles, the mouthpiece of the apostles in the Greek tradition. So, but we don't believe that that necessarily means that he has like this universal jurisdiction over all of the church, precisely because when you read the book of Acts, you don't see that. You see Peter going to the council in Jerusalem in Acts 15, and it's James that presides at that council because it's in Jerusalem, and James is the bishop of Jerusalem. We see Paul rebuking Peter. We see Peter basically submitting to the decisions of the council in Jerusalem. And so my final point would just be, look, if the Petrine position of Vatican I was literally what the scriptures taught, then why don't we see that process and that modus operandi actually happening in scripture? We don't see that. We see conciliarism. We see, let's have a council, let's get together, and because the whole church has the fullness of the Spirit. The whole church has the mind of Christ. It's not just one bishop that has that. The whole church has it. They have the fullness in the Eucharist. Therefore, we don't need a supreme Pontifex Maximus. And the fact that the Orthodox Church has continued to exist after the schism with plenty of people shows we don't need that. It's not necessary. If it was absolutely necessary, why didn't we just completely obliterate, like the Protestants, into a million schisms?
Well, I mean, to answer the first point, I'm not making the argument that you argued in the first point, that because the Catholic Church decided what was canon, I'm not making that argument. I'm making the argument based on scripture that Peter was given this primacy, he was given this authority. So for the first point, I'm not really going to answer that because that's not really my position. But to the second point, and sort of to answer that last part, just because it's the most fresh, you say, why in terms of Orthodoxy are we not fragmented into a number of different churches and everything? Well, I think it kind of is it not? I mean, you have the Greek Orthodox Church, you have the Russian Orthodox Church. I mean, there really isn't, if you go in the phone book, you can look, and there are a number of different Orthodox sects, whereas, Catholic Church, you just have one, right?
Okay, but that's a little bit of a slippery slope here, because first of all, the Orthodox Church operates the same way that the church operated for the first millennium. So there were always national churches. Anytime the apostles went out, when they converted people, what they would do is they would translate the scriptures and the liturgy into the vernacular. And that's why you have these historic churches going all the way back to these nations. Now, it wasn't always a whole nation, but eventually over time, under the imperium, you would have, for example, at an ecumenical council, the bishops of the various nations would meet and make decisions. They would debate, so forth and so on. So the fact that there are vernacular local liturgies, and even the Roman Catholic Church accepts 16 different vernacular liturgies as part of her liturgy, shows that just saying, well, because there's a Russian Orthodox Church and because there's a Greek Orthodox Church, that doesn't mean that there's necessarily a split or division, because Roman Catholicism has that as well. Secondly, I would say there have always been disagreements and dissensions in the church. You see this in the book of Acts. You see this all throughout the first millennium of the church. So dissensions and divisions, and a whole nation even going into schism, that's all throughout the councils. But I would just repeat the words of Pope Benedict Ratzinger in Introduction to Christianity, where he says, for the first millennium of the church, they operated in a conciliar fashion and not according to the Vatican I papal monarchy position. So even at Vatican II, you've had this recognition, and I'm not a fan of Vatican II. I think it was ultimately kind of a dismantling of the Western tradition, which is sad. But I'm saying you have this tacit agreement that, we need more collegiality, we need more conciliarism, because maybe we went too far with our ultramontane position at Vatican I. But again, to your first point, you in that argument may not have argued that we know the canon because of the papacy, but this is almost always the Roman Catholic apologist position. And as far as I know, I've never heard a Roman Catholic apologist deny that they know what the canon is because of the papacy's final decision. I mean, don't you believe that it was the magisterium of the church that decided, in your view, that decided what the canon of Scripture was?
Yes, but I mean, that's not the argument that I'm making to advance the general issue. I mean, that may be an argument that
Okay.
has been made. I probably believe that, but I don't know if that's, I think we're kind of gish galloping here a little bit away from.
No. I'm asking you a question of authority.
Which is something. Well, no, but wait, but I mean, I started out from my position, which was the reason that I'm a Catholic is because the Scripture gives this authority to Peter. It gives authority specifically to the church in Rome. And you answer with, well, there's this argument about canon. I don't think that's a very strong argument because I can't answer this contest. But I can talk about, for example, you talk about how, the papacy operated differently in the first millennium, and actually it was more of a conciliar approach, and that's actually not true. To get to the fundamental point, and we could go back and forth about whether or not having a Russian and a Greek and all these other different Orthodox churches in the United States and all operating with a certain degree of autonomy that is not present in the Catholic Church. To get to the fundamental point of that, which is, did the first millennium, was it operating under the more Roman type, or was it operating in the more autonomous Eastern type? It was clear. And I could give you several historical examples here where the church has deferred to Rome. And I can show you here.
No.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I will agree with you that, for example, in controversies where we would have, say, at the Sixth Council, St. Maximus the Confessor, famous Eastern theologian, he would actually have recourse to Rome and would speak of the longtime orthodoxy of Rome against his monothelite opponents. And I have absolutely no problem with the hallowed orthodoxy of the first hundreds and hundreds of years of Rome. No Orthodox person disagrees with that. But again, I think you're missing the point that the fact that there are ecumenical councils shows that we don't need a papal monarchy. I mean, why not just write a letter to Peter or to the Apostolic See and ask them how to solve the problem? Why do you even need an ecumenical council? Who called the councils? The emperor.
Sure. I'll tell you why. I'll tell you why. If you look at in the case with the heresy of Arianism, which I believe the Pope was Dionysius, the ecumenical council was called long after he had already made the decision. Long after he had made the decision to create the word, was it homo uvis, which was in substance. Yes, right. He had already made that decision. He called the ecumenical council as a means of translating that to the church. But if you look at in every case, for the most part, with these 7 ecumenical councils, in each case, the Pope had already decided before the council even met. And I wasn't even referring to the councils, but I was even referring to the times when other heresies arose, when other things happened. I mean, not even with the example you gave, but if you look in, for example, with Clement in 96 AD, which I'm sure you're familiar with, where they, to heal that schism in Corinth, they could have appealed to the Patriarch of Jerusalem. They could have went to the Patriarch of Alexandria. They could have went to Apostle John himself, who is alive, but they deferred to the Pope. And there are other examples of this as well. So
Paul, right? Paul writes a letter to Rome, and Paul corrects errors in the Roman Church. Paul is not a bishop of Rome. But Paul writes letters to the Roman Church, and he corrects errors, and he even threatens the Roman Church. In chapter 11, he says that you can be grafted out if you don't obey. This is a real threat when he's talking about Gentiles being grafted in, Jews being grafted out. The letter is written, yes, to the whole church, but also to the bishops of the Church of Rome. So it's not just written to threats to the lay people. So in other words, what I'm saying is that Paul very clearly warns the Roman Church. So somebody writing a letter to another church does not necessitate that, therefore, this was an appeal to the ultimate authority in the church, any more than Paul thinking that he can write a letter to the church in Rome and that, therefore, the Roman Church can be grafted out necessarily means that there's universal jurisdiction for this one. If there's universal jurisdiction for Rome, Paul wouldn't have written a letter rebuking them and warning them about being cut out. Secondly, no, every ecumenical council was called by the emperor. No pope called an ecumenical council. The popes and their legates were the first to sign it, yes, because that is, again, the position of the coryphaeus of the apostles, the mouthpiece of the apostles. And that's our view of how Peter is treated. So, but we don't see any position where Peter is treated as if he has universal jurisdiction. In fact, there's so many examples to the contrary that it's a strained mental gymnastics to try to pull it off. So, and I can prove that by merely pointing out that the Sixth Ecumenical Council condemned Pope Honorius. Now, I'm not saying Pope Honorius was wrong. Actually, he ended up being vindicated. However, the mind of that universally accepted council was that they could condemn a pope of old Rome, and they did in the Acts of the Council. So that shows you that their mindset was not Vatican I papal monarchy.
But Jay, who interprets the results of the councils and who executes the results of the councils? In every case, it is the Pope.
You just admitted my point about the canon and the Petrine text.
I did.
So your ultimate authority is the papal office, but originally you appealed to the scriptures to prove the papal office. So I'm asking you if which one of these is the way that you prove it, right? And in your worldview, in the Thomistic worldview, the classical traditional Catholic worldview, you're not supposed to have circular arguments.
Okay, well, but I think you have to understand that you have to have unity proceeds from one. It is necessary that you have, and it was necessary in each of the cases. If you're arguing, well, look, the Orthodox Church is doing just fine, we didn't need the Pope, we didn't need the higher authority, but if you look in every case with the ecumenical councils, and you can try and go back to, oh, well, this is circular logic, but the conciliarism didn't work unless there was a Pope to interpret and then execute the results of those councils. So you can go back to canon, but the fact of the matter remains that it is necessary that for a single dogma to be enforced, for it to be interpreted, it has to proceed from one church. It has to proceed from the Church of Rome, and I mean, there it is.
Well, number one, I would completely deny that's true. So the revelation of Scripture, for example, did not proceed from one pope or one church. It proceeded from the many apostles going out to the many nations, and they had everything that was sufficient for them to set up these churches. And many of them were sent out with no connection to Peter. Peter didn't have any direct knowledge of every single guy going out to the different nations in the first 3 centuries of the Roman Empire before it was Christianized. So I would completely deny that. That's just completely not true, mainly by the examples of what happens in Scripture. We can look at the book of Acts. How many times do people in Acts come to believe in Christ, not because of the preaching of merely the Roman bishop, but because Paul argues from the Scriptures. Paul argued from the Scriptures powerfully. It says this many times in the later chapters of Acts. So that's one easy way to disprove the claim that we only know what's unified and true based on what the Roman bishop says. The second problem with that is that it's just moving the problem back a step. How do you know that you're interpreting the Roman bishop's decrees and magisterium correctly? I mean, I have Denzinger here, and every time I argue with a Roman Catholic, the question is, you don't understand, the response is, you don't understand Denzinger. You don't know how to interpret Denzinger and the papal decrees properly. So who interprets the papal decrees properly? Ultimately, it's the Bishop of Rome. So it's like the Bishop of Rome confirms the Bishop of Rome by interpreting the Bishop of Rome by proving the Bishop of Rome. And so it's like this spiraling circularity that never ends. Last point, in the 8th century, you have a divide that's actually a predecessor to 1054. So there were 2 councils at this time. There's the Latin Council that's related to the Patriarch Ignatius in 858. The East rejected this council precisely because of the Filioque. Okay. In the East, there's a later council called the Council of 879/880. And the problem with the reason I bring this up is that if we want to talk about, again, papal jurisdiction and all this stuff, Pope John VIII, it is known, every Roman Catholic admits this, signed the Eastern Council, which forbade the use of the Filioque in the Creed. Now, when you read Dr. Carroll, the famous Catholic historian, when you read Philip Blosser, another famous Catholic apologist and philosopher, they are at pains to explain this. They all admit, yes, the Pope signed this forbidding of the Filioque, but again, it's just another example of the fact that the mindset of the church in the first millennium is not Vatican I. Why else would so many Vatican I apologists like Cardinal Newman be at pains and have to come up with this theory of doctrinal development, and the doctrine is like a tree and it grows and it kind of morphs into all these different things. If this was, I mean, so is it a thing that evolves that we understand only in 1890, right? Or is it a thing that is present and clear at the beginning?
Well, I think if we're going to go back to the original point where you say that there's no scriptural basis for Petrine supremacy, and you keep citing Acts, which is interesting. I'm kind of wondering why you don't cite, for example, the book of Matthew. I mean, Jesus Christ specifically says that he will build his church on the rock of Peter. He gives Peter the keys. And again, you keep saying, oh, well, this, Paul was able to advocate, and there's this, it's not deriving from just Peter. It's not deriving from just Rome, but the other apostles were there and they were spreading the gospel as well. But it was specifically said, I don't know how you can continue to discount the fact that Jesus Christ said, I will found my church on you, on Peter. And he gave him the keys. And he even says in Revelations that the chosen one has the keys. I mean, this goes back to David, and
the one who
say,
hold on.
Go ahead.
The one who has
wait. Actually,
okay.
Can I finish? Because I'll let you go on a little bit.
Sure.
And also people might say, oh, well, he was referring to the local church when he talked about the building the church on the rock, which was Peter. People say, oh, maybe this was the local church. This was the church of Jerusalem, which of course can't be true because James was the head of the church of Jerusalem. So when Jesus Christ said, I'm building my church on the rock, which is Peter, and Peter's name, of course, is a pun for the rock. I mean, this is clearly, I think it's hard to deny that Jesus is saying that would be the church. And you could go into Acts as well. Where Peter is the first one to perform a miracle in the church age. He was the first one to preach the gospel in the church age. He was the first one to refute heresy. He was the first man to raise a man from the dead. He exercised his power to bind and loose by allowing Gentiles into the church. And even though the other apostles, they initially were reluctant to accept this, they eventually did. Peter is the dominant personality out of all the apostles. He's spoken of 191 times. All the other apostles combined 130 times. And to get to the early church age, you say, oh, well, this was not how it went. It was not Vatican I, so to speak. But you can go to many church fathers in the days of the early church who all confirm this. There's actually not a single testimony in the days of the early church from the church fathers which denies the primacy of Rome. I mean, you could go to Patriarch Saint Menace of Constantinople, who said, we follow and obey the apostolic throne. We are in communion with those with whom it is in communion, and we condemn those with whom it condemns. You could go to Metropolitan Sergius of Cyprus, who says, O holy head, Christ our God hath destined by apostolic see to be an immovable foundation and a pillar of the faith. For thou art, as the divine word truly saith, Peter, and on thee as a foundation stone have the pillars of the church been fixed. And there are you could go for hours citing the early church fathers who affirmed the primacy of Rome, but you cannot find a single one who rejects it. So again, okay. I think there's a lot of evidence that's being left out here.
Okay, so I'm familiar with the kind of throwing out machine gun katina approach of quotations. I used to do the same thing. The first thing is, in regard to Peter, actually many of the church fathers do debate the meaning of Matthew 16. So they don't all say that it was specifically Peter, and I don't have a problem with it being a pun on his name, because any of these arguments is 100% night and day removed from the arguments made, for example, in the Galatian or the papal decretals. So if you're familiar with this is a later concoction that was all about the temporal power and supremacy of the Roman bishop over all monarchs in the world, so forth and so on. This eventually led to unum sanctum, the medieval no salvation outside the church dogmatic decree. So none of this is anywhere closely connected to universal temporal supremacy of a single bishop. Now, everything that you've said about Peter is true of all the apostles. Now, again, being the mouthpiece of the apostles is not a universal supremacy. That's two totally different things, right? So, for example, Jesus at the end of John breathes on all the apostles, and he says, whoever sins you remit, they are remitted. Whoever sins you retain, they're retained. The very thing that he said to Peter, he gave to all of them. He didn't tell Peter, breathe your breath on them because it comes from me to you to them. He'd breathe directly on all of them. And Peter absolutely is the leader of the apostles in the early church. And since he's the one that you're saying, he established the church in Antioch. I agree that he has set up the apostolic see. Does Antioch have Petrine papal supremacy? No. But Peter established it. So in other words, why is it the assumption? Oh, well, the assumption is that, well, Peter died in Rome, and so he must have then given it a mystical super supremacy. And for many, many, many centuries after the early church, do you know what was used to back this up?
What?
It was the papal decretals. And the papal decretals are universally admitted to be forgeries. The Vatican admits they are forgeries. They're not real, because they obviously, the church in the 1st and 2nd century was not writing about the Roman bishop having temporal supremacy. That's preposterous, because they were still being persecuted by the millions by the Roman emperors. By the way, Jesus is the one who holds the keys to death and hell in the apocalypse, not Peter. It's the one who descended into hell, the one who descended into hell, the harrowing of hell. That is our feast day, right? The harrowing of hell, the descent and the ascent. That's who has the keys to death and Hades. Jesus, not Peter.
Here, let me try and find the specific quotation here that I was referring to in Revelations, because I don't have it here in front of me here. He says in Revelations 3:7, he says, "Fear not, I am the first and the last and the living one. I died, and behold, I am alive forevermore. I have the keys of death and Hades." He says, "The words of the Holy One, who has the keys of David, who opens and no one shall shut, who shuts and no one opens." And he's referring, of course, to the royal keys he presented to Peter and Matthew. And you can say, oh, well, he breathed out all the apostles.
Everybody knows. I've never heard this argument. This is new to me. So, but it's Jesus speaking to the 7 churches in every one of those letters. It's not Peter.
Okay, but then why did he give the keys to Peter? Why did he say that Peter is the rock on which he founds the church? I don't understand how you discount the importance here of Peter. Wait, are you arguing that, well, Peter he's the dominant personality, he gets the keys, he's the rock on which the church is built, but that is merely of a symbolic, like, first among equals head at the table?
I just said that he gave the same power of remitting sins to the entire group of the apostles. So look, 2 things.
But is this arbitrary that he's he's always named first? It's the disciples and Peter. He gets the keys. Is that just simply an arbitrary distinction? I mean, what would be the purpose of that?
Peter is rewarded in Matthew 16 because it's the first time that anybody confesses that he's divine. So up until that time, throughout the Gospels, the apostles and even John the Baptist had been in doubt. They were like, "Is he a prophet? Is he? Who is he?" And then Peter is the first to make the divine confession. So it's not the man Peter. It is Peter and his confession, and it's deified Peter that is, you could say, a foundation stone of the church. When you read the Apocalypse, the New Jerusalem, it's a big new temple that's a big chunk block built on all of the names of the apostles. They're all there. Right. So it's not like there's only Peter and then all the other little apostles are stacked up on top of him like Cubert or something. It's a giant New Jerusalem temple with each foundation stone being the names of the apostles. So what is contained traditionally, this is across the board, Orthodox and Roman Catholics have always admitted that the promise of this text is 2 things. It's jurisdiction and it's spiritual. It's like a bishop having jurisdiction, and it's the ability to remit and retain sins. That's the office of the keys. This is what bishops have always done, and priests or presbyters as their helpers. So the East and West agree on that. Now, all I'm saying is that Jesus says the exact same thing to all of the apostles. He says in the Gospels, he says that when I enter into my kingdom, he says, you will all sit on 12 thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel. And that's always been interpreted as the authority of the apostles to judge the various churches. And again, we don't deny that there is, as the East has always said, the coryphaeus of the apostles, the mouthpiece of the apostles. And that's fine. And that's why many of the quotes that you're referring to, for example, if there is a controversy in the church, And a lot of those controversies were in the East. There were a lot of heresies in the East. Nestorius was the patriarch of Constantinople. That you would have Eastern the bishops that were correct believing would appeal to Rome. Okay, but appealing to Rome is not being they're not appealing to Rome just on the basis of the fact that that's because Peter was there one time. It's because the confession of Rome was always Orthodox throughout those centuries, except for the period there's a little bit of hairy area during the Arian crisis where one of the popes was forced to sign an Arian confession, but nobody accuses him of being an Arian just because he was forced to do it. But the point is simply that the power of jurisdiction and remitting sins throughout the rest of the Gospels is given to the whole corpus of the apostles. It's not just to Peter, or it's not Jesus giving it to Peter who then gives it to them. It's Jesus giving it to all of them, breathing on all of them, and then they go out as a body. So, and this is reflected in the early church makeup of in the ancient world. What were the primary sees or pentarchy? Right. This is not the basis of Orthodox theology. We don't believe that you have to follow like 5 historic sees, like they're little bitty popes or something. It's just that these are the big cities where it was prominent to have the bishopric of Rome, the bishopric of Alexandria, right? These are just prominent cities. That's all it means. And by the way, Orthodoxy still retains that. The Pope, the Patriarch of Constantinople, he has absolutely no authority or jurisdiction outside of Turkey. He can't tell the Patriarch of Moscow what to do. The Patriarch of Moscow can't tell bishops in the countryside of Russia what to do. That's because we believe Jesus intentionally wanted to set up a decentralized system. And it's decentralized just like it was in the Old Testament. You had the synagogue system going out and setting up synagogues in the world. There was one high priest. He was in Jerusalem. We would say that high priest is Jesus. We don't need, because of the coming of the Holy Spirit, we don't need the giant jurisdictional monarchy of Rome.
Again, I just think it is a lot of, I think what's happening here is a lot of rationalization, because you have here, I mean, right in front of you in the scripture, giving the keys and building on the rock. These are very striking symbols. These are very significant symbols. And Peter, the dominance of his personality throughout the New Testament and how he is first in everything, how he's referenced separate from the other disciples. When the angel comes to, but when Mary comes to Mary Magdalene, he says, go tell the disciples and Peter. He's always in every instance when the apostles are listed, he's always listed first. And you chalk this up to, well, this is simply a mouthpiece. I don't know. I mean, you can, and you draw out a lot of the Latin phrases and you throw out a lot of these, these little events and this and that. But I think it is fundamentally a distraction from what is in Matthew. It's fundamentally a distraction from the fact you say, oh, well, he breathed on everyone. And well, it's interpreted as they will all sit and judge the churches. But Peter was given the keys. Peter was the rock on which the church was built. Jesus Christ said, I pray for your faith. And you are supposed to fortify the faith of the others. Okay. And I mean, do you just ignore this? Do you acknowledge?
No, I addressed every one of those points. And first and foremost, you said that he's always in charge and always first. No, he's not.
No. I said he's always listed first. I said he's always listed first when the apostles are listed. That's what I said. A minute ago, you said he's always first. He's always in charge. He's always lit. I didn't say he's always. No. I did not say he's always in charge of everything. I said he's always listed first, and I said he was given the keys, and he was the rock on which the church was built.
He doesn't preside at the council in Jerusalem.
Okay, but how do you interpret Jesus Christ says you are the rock on which the church is built? He was speaking to all the. He was speaking to all the apostles in a corporate way when he said that. When he gave the keys to Peter, he was giving it to all of them.
So I addressed this a minute ago. I said, first of all, there is debate amongst the church fathers as to what that text means. And what I said to you was that it doesn't matter if it's Peter himself, and that we don't have a problem with that, but it's not Peter himself. Huh?
I think it kind of does matter, I think, right? I mean, if Peter is,
because my point was that is arbitrary. That is infinite miles away from universal temporal jurisdiction over all princes in the world. That is crazy talk, dude.
If he's given the keys by Jesus Christ, then that's a far cry from that he has supremacy among the other patriarchs and bishops.
No. I don't think you understand the extent of the claims of the papacy. The papacy, after the rise of the papal states and after the early centuries, after the false papal decretals, literally claimed that the Bishop of Rome had universal supremacy, not just over spiritual issues in the church, but over all princes. That's why there is a new emperor anointed in 800 called Charlemagne, because they didn't want an Orthodox emperor in the East. They wanted to go their own way. And by the way, this is the time period when things change in the church. There's no more icons. There's only statuary. There's no more paedo communion. You see, the early church universally gave children, babies, communion. Now, isn't it interesting that Rome stops doing this? Literally, at the period when the Filioque enters, when we have a new emperor in the West, Charlemagne, all of these distinctions, when we already had a God-ordained emperor in the East. The fact that there's a God-ordained emperor in the East that's recognized for all of these ecumenical councils, who calls the councils, not the Pope, shows that Peter doesn't have universal temporal jurisdiction. So I don't have a problem with confining and debating the meanings of Matthew 16 to the church and to what it meant to the first century church. That's what the church fathers do. Mm-hmm. Some of them say it's Peter. Some of them say it's his confession. Some of them say it's this or that. But what I said to you in response specifically was that all of the things that you claimed were special to Peter are also given to the other apostles directly by Jesus. He gives them the power to remit sins. He says they will sit on the thrones judging the church.
But they don't get the keys. But they don't get the keys.
That's the meaning of keys. That's what I was telling you a minute ago, that everybody, Rome, East and West, always admits. What does that mean? It's not keys to death and hell that Jesus has. It's the keys to have jurisdiction and to remit and retain sins.
Well, it has precedent in Isaiah. It has precedent in Isaiah when the keys were used as a symbol of the king giving authority to the prime minister. Yeah. And so, yeah. And so there it is.
Jesus. That's Jesus.
Yeah. Jesus is the king and the prime minister is Peter. That's why he gives the keys to Peter. Peter is given the authority as the prime minister.
If that's the case, then what happens is, and this happened in the history of the church, then local bishops are eventually viewed as lacking something, right? So in other words, you can be at a church in Ephesus or whatever, and you can have the Eucharist, but it's not the Church of Rome where Peter was. And so therefore what you eventually get, and this is in Unum Sanctum, the papal decree actually says that Peter and the Petrine office, because of this prime minister view, it actually has a superior special super union with Jesus beyond what any of the other bishops say. Now, there is a famous argument and dialogue that Pope St. Gregory the Great has with a person who was claiming something very similar. These are in his letters, and he rebukes this as the claim of Antichrist, right? Because they were claiming to have sole jurisdiction over all of the churches, right? And negating the real jurisdiction that other bishops had. So what I'm saying is that this has played itself out in church history, and even a great pope like Pope St. Gregory the Great rebuked the idea in his letters, very well known. And I'm not making the Protestant argument that this means that there's no such thing as bishops. The Protestants go crazy with this. It's a dumb argument, but it does prove the point that obviously Pope St. Gregory the Great didn't, Gregory the Dialogist, that he's called in the East, he didn't view this as temporal supremacy over all princes and so forth. That's
okay.
Crazy.
So then why are you trying to force me to defend that as temporal supremacy then? If the great Pope says it's not temporal supremacy, then why are you, do you understand where I'm coming from? If the Catholic great Pope
Roman Catholic theology eventually dogmatized that it is.
That it is temporal, or that it is not
Absolutely.
Temporal? Okay. Well, again, I don't understand how you can look at the keys being given and and again, going back to Matthew with the keys, that just bears no significance for you. What did the keys represent, if not jurisdiction as the prime minister over the church? As
I just gave you, I just told you twice what it meant.
Oh, well, what is it?
Okay.
There's a lot in there. Every time you give me an answer, we go all over the place. So can you tell me in a very direct way?
Yeah, very direct. Okay, so historically,
right?
both East and West.
Okay.
As far as I'm aware, and all the church fathers here, I've never seen this disputed. You have the discussion of what jurisdiction or the keys is.
Right.
This gets heavily debated in later medieval Catholic theology, where they debate exactly whether or not you can attend a schismatic mass, whether or not you can attend a bishop's church who has no jurisdiction, and so the loss of keys means loss of jurisdiction. This all gets debated in Roman Catholic canon law. So what I'm saying is that there's not really a whole lot of debate as to what exactly having the office of the keys means. And as far as I'm aware, it's always explained to be the power of jurisdiction over your area, and the power to remit and retain sins. And then, of course, the power to perform sacraments later will be added onto that. And throughout the book of Acts, when the apostles and so forth go out and they do chrismations. Now, so as far as I'm aware, that's always been what's conceived of as the meaning of keys. It's usually described or referred to in terms of jurisdiction. So absolutely, I never denied that Peter was given the keys. No Orthodox person has ever denied that.
I didn't say you did. I didn't say you denied it. I think you deny or maybe deflect from the significance of that.
No. See, what you're doing is that you're reading into this. This is what every Roman Catholic apologist does. Is that he reads into this.
Interesting.
All of the Roman Catholic, all of these.
Well, you were a Roman Catholic apologist, right?
Yeah, for 10 years.
Yeah. Yeah. Is this what I mean? What I'm having trouble being convinced that Peter is the dominant force in the New Testament. I've been saying this over and over, and I asked for this direct answer, and you tell me, oh, well, people kind of agree that it actually just means jurisdiction over your area, which I don't even believe that, because there are so many examples here in the days of the early church where the Bishop of Rome, where the church in Rome is deferred to when it shouldn't have been. When, if what you're saying is true, it should have not been the case. Like I said in the example with the schism in Corinth, where if it was just all the apostles have jurisdiction, why didn't they go to St. John, who was closer to Corinth than Rome was, than the Bishop of Rome? But they deferred to him anyway. In the 2nd century, Pope Victor I excommunicated a number of Eastern churches, and nobody even doubted his authority to do that. Why was the Bishop of Rome able to threaten to excommunicate all these different Eastern churches unless they ceased their heresies? And nobody even questioned his authority to do that. There was, in the 3rd century, the Pope who wrote to Patriarch Dionysius of Alexandria demanding an explanation of reports from other Egyptian bishops that Arianism was spreading in his church. I mean, there are so many examples of this in the 3rd century, in the 2nd century, in the 4th century, where people defer to the Church of Rome, and you're trying to make it out like, oh, actually people interpreted it this way, and really it wasn't that. I think the historical case is against you, and I also think you're ignoring the significance of the fact that Jesus Christ, he breathed on the other apostles, but he prayed for Peter's faith. He gave the keys to Peter. He built the church on the rock that is Peter. And you're trying to say, well,
Peter's faith because Peter denied him 3 times. That's why he confirmed it 3 times.
Right. Okay. But he confirmed it 3 times for Peter, and you are trying to say that. Okay,
but where do you get from this?
3 times. Yeah. Go ahead.
Where do you get from this to infallibility and universal temporal supremacy? Like how none of these texts, nobody in their right mind could go from that to that. And that's what became Roman Catholic dogma. And I'm saying that shows that something is way off here. This is not right. And it's not just, let me go back to the church fathers and find this quote and that quote, this quote about how important Peter was. Nobody denies the importance of Peter. What's denied is universal supremacy. And there's no argument for that. And if you go to the church fathers appealing to Rome, it's absolutely, you can absolutely appeal to preeminent bishoprics when they're Orthodox. The same thing happens throughout the church. You will have appeals to the Pope of Alexandria called Saint Athanasius. He was the Pope. That's a title of big metropolitan bishoprics or sees. The Pope in Alexandria, Saint Athanasius, condemned powerfully all of these heresies. the book of the Apocalypse is only in the Bible because St. Athanasius convinced people in Rome that it should be in the Bible.
Well, he convinced, but he convinced people in Rome. And but was it people outside of Rome who put it in the Bible, or is it people who convinced the people in Rome to put it in, and the people in Rome put it in the Bible? You have it this weird way.
You're not listening. You're not listening. So so there were a lot of churches that already use this.
Right. And
nobody denies that there is a primacy, a kind of honor given to old Rome. That's in all
just honor. I don't think it. I think it's true. Again,
it's not.
If you're trying to compare,
why would there be ecumenical councils? All you have to do is appeal
because they use it. They use it as a device. They use it. It doesn't say that.
Why would you even do that?
Well, because that is one of the temporal ways that the Pope would have his decision on these matters be spread and be decided on it. An ecumenical council, you have to look at it in terms of it pragmatically, not as though the ecumenical council.
Well, you were arguing a minute ago that the best pragmatic way was to just listen to what Clement said to Corinth.
No, I said that was an example. No. I said that was an example of when people deferred to the Pope. But sometimes a Pope, the ecumenical council is useful for the Pope to have bishops come and they discuss. But in every case, in every ecumenical council, the Pope had already made the decision before the ecumenical council, and after the ecumenical council, the Pope was the one who interpreted it and executed it. But again, to the existence of councils,
the popes did not call any councils. No Pope called a council.
Yeah, no, but they said, okay, you're getting into technicalities here. But the point being,
well, who called Vatican I?
Well, of course, it's not the Pope, it's the Emperor, but it's the Pope that signs on to it.
Who called Vatican
technicalities? Who?
That's not a technicality. That's a
it is a technical. Who called it?
The Pope.
Okay, but again, you're going back to
a technicality. This technicality shows that universal temporal supremacy is not true.
No, wrong. Because again, you're trying to say that the mere existence of a council is proof that the council is what determines what is true and what is not true.
No, I'm saying that's not the argument. The argument is that ecumenical councils shows that the Vatican I view of the papacy is not true. And that's why Ratzinger says that the first millennium of the church didn't have the papal monarchy view of Vatican I.
But then why is it that nobody questioned the authority of the Pope to intercede in every one of these affairs whenever there was some kind of a schismatic
I just gave you examples of rejections.
No, you didn't give me examples of rejections. You gave me examples where people persuaded the Pope to exercise their jurisdiction over the other churches.
I gave you an example of St. Athanasius convincing Rome
convincing them. Yeah, to put the book in the Bible. But ultimately, who executed that
Nick,
needed to be persuaded.
Nick, there were already churches for hundreds of years that had been using different canons. Okay, so I'm not saying that because St. Athanasius convinced Rome to convince Rome to put the Apocalypse in the canon, that's why the whole world has the Apocalypse. There were already churches using the Apocalypse.
Okay, but I think
No, you're not listening. You're not listening. What I'm saying is that there was a superior theologian named St. Athanasius, who was the Pope of Alexandria. The bishops of Alexandria are still called that. And he showed the Roman bishop where he was incorrect because they were going to, in their jurisdiction, remove the Apocalypse.
Okay, but again, I think the language betrays the fact that the bishop in Alexandria was not the executor of who put what in the Bible. He had to persuade. It's a very different thing. No. It's a very different thing. Hey, I'll let you finish. It's a very different thing to say. It's a very different thing to say that people came to the Bishop of Rome in many instances, whether it was a schism in Corinth, whether it was a bishop who was not vacating the episcopal residence, whether it was in the instance where, who was it? Let me pull it up here. In one instance where two Eastern councils evicted somebody and the Pope reestablished it. I mean, there are so many instances where the churches at the time, in the early days of the church, deferred to the ruling of Rome, deferred to Rome giving authority, having jurisdiction, than to say that somebody in Alexandria persuaded a bishop in Rome to put something in the Bible. Those are very different things.
You're not listening.
I think I am.
No, you're not. I've already
think I am.
explained to you that I'm not saying that there wasn't in the West, in old Rome, honor. And
Oh, no. But honor is a very different thing than deference. Honor is a very different thing.
Honor is a very different thing than universal temporal supremacy.
Right. Okay. But what are you executing? Are you executing honor? Are you executing honor when people defer to your bishop, to the successor of Peter, over a living apostle? Is that honor, or is that primacy?
Nick, our bishops are successors of Peter. He established the church in Antioch. Everyone knows this.
Okay, yeah, but then he established the church in Rome. Why did they go to? What? Okay, but why did they go to Rome and not Antioch?
They did go to Antioch. So what I'm trying to explain to you is that listen, the way that the early church functioned was that it had a pentarchy. It had
there were heretics in the pentarchy, correct?
Absolutely.
Okay,
and guess
then
what?
how can that function? Then how can that function? How can that be the church over which the gates of hell cannot prevail if you have heretics in the pentarchy?
That is a preposterous argument, because because our view of the church is not that you have to follow these 5 bishoprics. In fact, at one point, the Arian crisis, there were only a handful of bishops that were still Orthodox. So Athanasius, for example. So listen, any one of these, or all 5 of those patriarchates could fall into heresy, and we know this because throughout the history of the church, every one of them at some point did, and even Rome was accused of heresy at the 6th Council.
Accused,
and that's an ecumenical council.
Accused, but were they ever heretics?
It doesn't matter, because the mind of the church
matters. It so matters.
Listen, the mind of the church at that ecumenical council was not that this guy could never fail.
But again, the church is a very different thing being accused of a heresy than committing a heresy. If you are appealing, if you are appealing to the pentarchy, if you are appealing,
dude, you don't understand. I'm not appealing to pentarchy.
Then why'd you bring it up?
I'm explaining a fact of how the early church operated.
Okay, but it did not operate in this way. People did not appeal to these different churches the way that they did with Rome. They deferred to Rome.
Have you read the apostolic canons? Everybody in their jurisdiction appeals to their bishop. That's that's a no-brainer.
When it comes to a schism, when it comes to a heresy, when it comes to somebody who needs to be evicted, when it comes to somebody who's been wrongly evicted, in each of these cases, you simply just
in each of these cases. This happened constantly. You think that the whole world, this is so stupid. You think that the whole world literally appealed to Rome in every case?
Well, no, I think in the case of Clement, they appealed to the Bishop of Rome.
They didn't appeal to him.
Why did they appeal? Okay, but why did they not go to a living apostle, to John the Apostle himself?
Okay,
why did they go to Rome?
This is a terrible argument. First of all, we don't know exactly the date of John's death.
I mean, okay, well, disprove it. Don't tell me it's a terrible argument. Disprove it.
John was on the island of Patmos. Do you even know what you're talking about?
Which at the time in 96 AD, he was closer to Corinth than was the Bishop of Rome.
Exiled to an island.
Look, even if it's not the Apostle John, why didn't they go to the Patriarch of Alexandria then? If it was the Pentarch system, why didn't they go to the Patriarch of Alexandria?
Nick, everybody admits that there's a Pentarchy. I already said in the first hour, that's not a Roman Catholic version in Orthodoxy. Like, we don't appeal to these 5 people.
Okay.
I'm just saying.
But then why was it Rome? Why was it Rome and not Alexandria?
Listen to me.
I've been listening.
Okay. Anybody in the church, I already explained this with St. Maximus the Confessor, could appeal to different sees. Okay. So let's say you were in an Arian area in St. Athanasius's time. Okay. You might, if your bishop was Arian, you might appeal to either Rome, because you knew that Rome was Orthodox, not just because it was Rome, but you knew it was Orthodox, and it also had Rome as the honor of old Rome. Or you might appeal to Alexandria, to St. Athanasius, because you knew that those 2 places did not teach Arianism.
Mhm.
So the appeal is not based on juridical authority. The appeal is based on correct doctrine. You know that they're not Arian. So all I'm saying is,
it was arbitrary. That you're saying it's because they were
I
one.
just said it was based on correct doctrine. That's not arbitrary.
Well, but I mean, in terms of which church that was correct on doctrine, it's
what you would listen.
Correct. It's arbitrary that they chose Rome, right?
No.
Listen. Then why did they choose Rome? But wait. If there are multiple churches that are not Arian, why did they go to Rome? Why did they? It was an arbitrary choice. Once they looked at, once they figured out, okay, Rome is correct on doctrine, and let's say this other church is correct on doctrine, that they chose Rome over that other church that was correct on doctrine. You're saying, well, they went to Rome, and any other church which is correct on doctrine because it's correct. But why did they? You're saying after you've decided it's correct, then why Rome? Then it's just an arbitrary, well, they're all correct. These ones are correct. Let's pick that one.
No, I didn't say it was arbitrary. Why
Rome? Because of honor.
Will you let me talk?
Okay, go ahead.
The pentarchy system is not arbitrary. It arose precisely because I'm trying to explain it to you, what the pentarchy system is. Okay. Go ahead. It arose in the first 4 centuries because of prominent cities. And there might be different reasons why those cities were prominent. So Alexandria at this time was prominent because of it being Egypt, because of it being having a large library, rumors of that large library, right? It was a big metropolitan area. And so these kinds of churches would gain a lot of power. They would gain a lot of status over time. And that's why, for example, when Constantinople was built, it became New Rome. Now, I'm not saying that the Patriarchal Constantinople is our version of a pope. I'm not saying that the pentarchy system is 5 little popes. I'm not saying that. All I'm telling you is an observation of how the early church arose, and this is not debated. Okay, so when there's a large heresy that spreads, and this happens many times, and it could spread in the East or the West. If you were in an area where you didn't have access to a correct believing bishop, you would probably appeal to any places that were prominent and that had a lot of prestige and that had a reputation for orthodoxy. And that would be Old Rome. It might be Alexandria. It might be Antioch. It might be any of these places. And that's what you see in the councils. The councils will list Old Rome, New Rome, and they will give new titles to people. This is how the pentarchy system developed. It's from the ecumenical councils. They give titles. They gave Alexandria the title of Pope because it achieved a level of honor. Nobody believed that any of those places had the ability to tell the entire church what they had to do. And the fact, I've given you probably 20 examples that shows that that's the case. So what you've done is give me a bunch of examples where people appealed to an Orthodox Pope when they were persecuted by heretics. And I've already admitted that in the first hour.
Not people, churches. And here's an example. Let me ask you about this example and tell me what you think about this. I don't know if you're familiar with this one, but in the 3rd century, Paul of Samosata, a bishop of Antioch, he rejected the personhood of the Logos. That was condemned by 3 synods that consisted of the bishops of Syria, Palestine, and Asia Minor. And who was named as a replacement for Paul after he refused to stop preaching this heresy? He was evicted, he was excommunicated, but he refused to vacate the episcopal residence. Dominus was named as his replacement, but of course, Paul, he didn't leave his residence. Now, the emperor could have easily installed Dominus if what you're saying is true about the pentarchy and, a church that is not false could have intervened in this case. Instead of the bishop of Syria, instead of the bishop of Palestine, instead of the bishop of Asia Minor, all 3 together, or the emperor, who did they appeal to? Who did the emperor go to ask who should be the next patriarch? They went to the bishop of Rome, and the bishop of Rome installed Dominus as the patriarch. So why is it then if actually the emperor has the authority, or actually every pope that is preaching good doctrine are appealed to in the age of the early church, why was it in this instance that they went to Rome?
Well, this just illustrates a very basic misunderstanding of Orthodox theology. No emperor has authority in the church, and no emperor makes the decision to remove bishops. Now, many emperors persecuted the church, and even like iconoclast emperors persecuted Christians, but they were later defeated, and Orthodoxy triumphed in 787 at the Seventh Council, for example. So no emperor has the say-so in the spiritual jurisdiction. We agree that there is a kind of a temporal and a spiritual realms. They're not strictly divided. There's not two different bodies of Christ like medieval Roman Catholic theologians would say. There's only one body of Christ.
Nice snipe there, but go ahead.
There's only one body of Christ. And so in other words, a decentralized system that will appeal to patriarchates that had primacy is something that we still see today in Orthodoxy. So for example, if somebody in Russia—
You're not answering the question.
I am answering the question. I'm saying that this is a praxis that has always existed and still exists in Orthodoxy.
Yeah, they always defer to Rome, then, right? That's demonstrated in this example.
Did the Sixth Council defer to Rome when they condemned the Pope?
No, but we're not talking about. We're talking about this specific. You said
example. They always defer to Rome. They don't always defer to Rome.
No. We're talking in this example. Why did the Bishop of Syria? Why did none of these people? Why were they not able to do it, but they had to go to Rome?
Okay, I said a minute ago, during the Arian crisis, a large portion of the empire—
Okay, but why? Okay, but Syria and Palestine and Asia Minor all recognized that this was a heresy. They were the ones that excommunicated Paul Samosata. So why did they not? Why did they not replace him? Why did they not have all three of them? They were the ones that excommunicated the guy. Why were they not the ones to replace him? Why were they not the ones to go in there? If you're saying, oh, well, it's any church, why did they have to go to Rome to name the successor and to install him?
Because I already told you that nobody denies the
place of honor. The place of honor. That's a stretch, Jay. The place of honor.
That's the wording of the councils for the old Rome.
No, but to say that that's simply a place of honor instead of jurisdiction, I think is a pretty generous interpretation of honor. I mean, that's jurisdiction. If there's deference.
That's why I can explain things like the council condemning the Pope, and you can't.
Well, I'm not familiar with that particular example, but in this example, you cannot explain. That's not very nice. But in this particular example, I fail to see how this is merely— you seem to chalk everything up here where people defer to Rome, where churches go out of their way to send their rulings on this to Rome, where they go out of their way to clear things with Rome, where Rome intervenes in the schisms, where Jesus Christ gives his keys to Peter, he builds the church on Peter, and in every instance it's, oh well, that's a place of honor. Oh, well, that's actually has a lot less significance. It seems to just be, it's apologetics. It's a rationalization. It's a denial.
The wording that I use to you when I talk about the honor of old Rome, this is the wording of the councils. So when Nicaea, and then later when Ephesus, when Constantinople, and Constantinople too, when they talk about these bishoprics, that's their language. So it's not me deferring. It's not me making up. It's not
but you're saying that when Rome does this, they are acting in their capacity as in a place of honor instead of in their place as having jurisdiction. And I'm saying, to say that's the place of honor, I think that's jurisdiction. I think you're chalking that up to, because Rome does have a place of honor, but for the Catholics, they also have jurisdiction. And you're saying, well, in each of these cases, this is merely the capacity of Rome is having honor and not having jurisdiction, right?
Right. And again, I don't accept that. But if that's all that Roman Catholicism said, there might have never been a schism. But what happened is that Rome didn't stop at just saying, well, I can intervene and help in a conflict that's 2,000 miles away. It extended into a vast claim of the entire universe, that the Pope has total authority over all temporal and spiritual matters. There's no way to get from what Peter says to what Jesus says to Peter to the Pope being able to have a giant Rothschild run bank. I mean, that's just, how do we get from that to that?
How do we get from that to the Rothschild's bank thing? I think that's kind of a little bit of a distraction there. I mean, you're kind of getting away again from the point where
no, this is not theoretical. This is what happens in history. This is a real historical church.
Yeah, no, I think we could just as easily say that if Constantinople had the same honor, why did they bow to pressure from the Ottoman Turks and withdraw from the Council of Florence? I mean, we can throw a lot of things in there, I think.
Okay, but we have no problem saying that any of those pentarchs, any of those patriarchs could fall into heresy. And in fact, I mean, Bartholomew seems to be heretical. He could easily be a heretic.
Don't you think though that seems pretty? I mean that if the highest degree of authority in the church is just the patriarch, just the highest degree of authority is, you know, maybe the first among equals, which, you know, if there wasn't a schism would be Rome. Don't you think that's kind of weak? If they can all fall into heresy, don't you think that's kind of a weak argument that Jesus Christ would leave his church? And Jesus Christ specifically said that his church would never be taken over by the gates of hell. And yet you say that, oh, well, bishops are subject to heresy. And I guess you think that Rome is subject to heresy. How can that be? How can the gates of hell never triumph over the church if the highest degree of authority has been triumphed over several times in many cases?
This is a mistaken presupposition about how to hold together the body of the church, and that it must require a single imperial papal monarchy as the only means by which the church would hang together. And I'm saying, first of all, the fact that Orthodoxy still exists, teaching the exact same thing that we've always taught, everything that St. Basil says, we say, everything that St. John Damascus says, we still say, and this is 1,000 years of not having communion with Rome. The fact that we still exist and we are still spreading, we are converting people, shows that we don't need what you're talking about to continue to exist.
Oh, you know that's flimsy. You know that's flimsy.
No, it's not, because we're talking about history.
Well, no, and here's why it's flimsy, because you're saying, oh, well, you know, our church isn't, our church is doing just fine. I mean, that's not really the arbiter of true or not. If there's a systemic problem that the highest
level. This is a constant argument that Roman Catholics make, that there's no way to continue with the unity of the church without the Bishop of Rome. And I'm saying
there's no way you could know that it's, there's no way that you could know that what you're saying is the truth if you don't have an infallibility, if you don't have a pope. If they could fall into heresy, who's to say that your patriarchs are not heretical? Who's to say that they will never not become all heretical? Right.
This is a basic epistemological misunderstanding that Roman Catholics have, where they move the problem back a step.
Charming.
Okay, Nick. So within Roman Catholicism, there are, within what is claimed to be, there's the SSPX, there's the FSSP, there are liberals like Hans Küng, there are the neoconservatives of Vatican II, there's a set of Vacantists. So all of these people claim that they have real Catholicism. So, and every one of them will say, we read the papal decrees correctly. So all you've done is move the problem back a step by saying that we have the Pope and that's how we know for sure. How do you as an individual know for sure that you are interpreting the Pope's decrees correctly? Because
we know from the priest. We know from the priest and the bishops and the cardinals, and they all proceed from the Pope. They all proceed from the, well, but the Pope's dogma is infallible, and the bishops and the cardinals are tasked with carrying it out. I mean, if you get down to it, outside of the, what? Why is this funny?
That's circular.
It's not
circular. I'm asking you how you know. You said you know from a fallible guy who's a priest, because he got it from the Pope who's infallible.
Yeah, sure. So and the Pope
chain is a circular nonsense.
Well, but I can read. I can read what the Pope has said. I can read
so now it's you as an individual reading, and see, that's my argument, is that
it's funny how you have to.
I can know truth directly.
You have to become a positivist essentially, and you have to reject, like, well, Pete. Well, technically, we don't really know anything. Do you see the kind of?
I mean, I argue constantly. I argue constantly for absolute objective truth. So, but that you would say that, I think, shows a complete misunderstanding.
No, but look at what you have to do, though. You have to say, well, how do we really know anything? I mean, you reading the dogma, this degree of separation between the Pope who is infallible saying it and you reading it. Well, you could interpret the infallible dogma any way you want, and the way it's supposed to be interpreted. I don't know. I just think it's kind of a disingenuous tactic. That's all.
I mean,
an objective truth, that seems a little disingenuous.
Okay, but objective truth is different from saying that an argument for the existence of objective truth is different from basic empiricism. So Roman Catholic Thomistic theology is a kind of naive empiricism, where they say that you just read the papal document, and if you're honest, you'll come away with what's true. But I mean, this is not what happens in praxis. There's all of these different groups who read the papal documents, and there's a lot of disagreement in Roman Catholicism. There's disagreement in Orthodoxy. I'm not denying there's disagreement, but to think that what I'm saying means that there's no absolute truth is a bit crazy.
Well, I mean, it's also kind of this. Yeah, go ahead.
We believe that individuals who participate in Christ, that we have participation in the Logos. So we have a direct perception of the things of God in the world, of the truths of God. We don't have to go through a bunch of mediators. That doesn't mean that there's no church. The fact that Christ became incarnate shows us the need for the church. But Roman Catholicism's basic empirical answer to how to solve all the problems by saying that, well, we just go with what that guy says over there, that just moves the problem back a step, because the question is not, can we have a empirical juridical office over here that tells everybody what to do? You're asking a question of how do we know what's true? And I'm saying that you can never escape the individual knowing what's true. Otherwise, you wouldn't be a Roman Catholic. How do people convert to Roman Catholicism if they don't study and learn these things on their own individually, led by the Spirit, obviously? And if they do, then you already admit you don't have to have a single bishop of Rome.
Well, I like how you say so that guy over there said it. You know, earlier when we started, you said, "Oh, how could that guy say, oh, some guy was just the president or the secretary of state?" And now you're saying, oh, because that guy over there said it, you know, the Bishop of Rome, the successor to St. Peter. That's not an arbitrary, this is not a trivial, you know, when he puts out his dogma.
The Bishop of Antioch is the successor to Peter.
And this is more disingenuousness. This is not an arbitrary thing that the Bishop of Rome is saying something. And again, it is. And how long have we been at this here? We've been at this for about an hour, going in circles, where you say, well, you know, these examples don't really count, and well, founding on the rock and him getting the keys.
I never said that. I gave you a reply to everything you said.
No, it doesn't really count. And well, you know, look at this. And again, you bring it over. You say, oh, well, Catholics don't actually have absolute truth. They can't really trust the Pope because, well, there's SSPX and there are other people that break away. There's modernists and traditionalists.
You say you're infallible. How do you know that you read the papal documents right?
I said the Pope is infallible. And to compare SSPX with the autonomous different churches of Orthodoxy on a systemic level is disingenuous, because what you hold in the Orthodox Church is that, well, you know, one guy, the Russian Orthodox Church and the Greek Orthodox Church, they are autonomous, and neither of them are infallible. If the bishop in Rome says something is true and the bishop in Greece disagrees, well, you know, that'll just have to stand, I guess, into an ecumenical council, and then, you know, the council will decide basically by a majority, and then that'll be the case. But that's a far cry. Saying that nobody has authority is a far cry from saying that, you know, somebody has authority, but it can be misinterpreted, or, you know, a priest could misinterpret. You know, there's a bishop in Germany just this week who said, oh, actually, priests can marry homosexuals. And everybody in the Catholic Church said, no, you're wrong. We do not have the autonomy to do that kind of a thing. Our authority comes from Rome. And so that you would try and make that argument, I think just highlights how disingenuous you have to be to compare and contrast. Oh, well, SSPX doesn't recognize the divine authority of the Pope, and that's the same as nobody having divine authority. Those are very different things. Can't you acknowledge that? I
never said nobody has divine authority. Bishops have divine authority. Councils have divine authority. The Bible has divine authority.
Interesting. Well, I mean, how do you know then? How do you know if who's interpreting one correct, or if somebody else is interpreting it correct? You're not
understanding the epistemological argument. It's very simple, okay? I'm saying that you have two options here. We can either say there's an empirical external thing that we can appeal to and interpret, and maybe we get it right, maybe we don't. Or we have a direct connection to what's true. And every Roman Catholic apologist, as you've done throughout this debate, exemplifies this constant circularity of how they know what's true. At first, it was appealing to the Bible for the Petrine text. That's how you know Peter is true. Now it's the only way that we know absolute truth is what Peter says. So you in this debate have exemplified that dialectic, that constant circularity that I've been pointing out the whole time.
Because you have to go outside for truth. You have to go outside for truth. At a certain point, I mean, do you think that, and it's specifically in terms of God and in affairs where, you know, the human intellect is not even capable of fully understanding, do you think it can rely on this alone, that maybe this patriarch gets it right, or maybe the ecumenical council gets it right? I mean, we say at a certain point that the buck has to stop somewhere. I don't think that happens in Orthodoxy.
Right. All throughout this debate, what we've seen is, on your part, a doubt of the kind of church that I'm talking about. I think that's fair. And that rests on a misunderstanding of what we say about man's anthropology, God, and what the church is. So for us, the church is the body, the icon of Christ. It has the fullness, everything necessary in the local church. There's nothing that's needed outside of it, because if it didn't have it in the local church, then what is the point of going to the Eucharist and being a part of the body of Christ in the local church if it's lacking? Jesus didn't set up a church to be universal that's lacking. So we believe that man has a body, a soul, and a nous. That is a faculty by which God made him. Paul talks about body, soul, and spirit, this tripartite view, that God gave us this faculty for knowing him. The way that we come to know him is not just like a Platonic thing where I sit and I meditate or something like that. You have to be joined to the body of the church. Absolutely. So there is a juridical aspect to the church, but there's not a juridical imperial aspect to the church. That's what we reject, and that's what's nowhere in the Bible, and that's why it's had to be propped up by papal decretals and forgeries like that to lead to unum sanctum and the Pope, you know, creating new emperors and so forth.
Well, I have to
listen.
You.
One last point on that. This is very, very, very crucial. So, as a Roman Catholic, what happens in the view of the world that you have is that you don't have a direct interaction and confrontation with Christ. And the way that you answered my questions shows that presupposition is in your worldview, because you don't see how what I'm saying could allow for a church to hold together. Jesus, the Logos, is preeminent, and he is immanent in everything through his logoi. That means that he is in him we live and move and have our being, as Paul says. We don't need a human power source like super high priest to keep the church together, because Christ has the power to keep the church together. It's that simple. And how do we know what's true? But the only way to answer that question is by a direct contact with Christ. That's what Paul says. Paul says in 2 Corinthians that we see Christ face to face. We have a direct experience with God. It comes through the church, absolutely, but it's not a bunch of created forms and symbols that's postponed to the beatific vision.
It sounds a lot like Protestantism. It's striking. I had a very similar discussion with a Protestant pretty recently, where they said, "Why do you need the church? Why do you need to go through the church? Why do you need to go through a priest to have a relationship with God? Why do you need to go to church at all to have a relationship with God?" I think, talk about slippery slopes. That sounds like, you know, you said, why do we need a super bishop? Why do we need a super priest? It's because I think that kind of reliance, kind of you know, in the decentralized way that the Orthodox is, that reliance on, you know, this quote unquote personal relationship. I think Catholics do believe in a personal relationship with Christ, but we understand that it's mediated by a clergy, by somebody with authority. I think for somebody to define what is in the faith and what is not in the faith, you have to have authority. I mean, who's to say that if
I never denied authority. I mean, we hold the councils to be authoritative.
Well, yeah, and the councils are determined by bishops who you yourself said can be heretical. What if a bunch of heretical bishops get together, form a council, and they make a decision? Who's to say that's wrong? Who's to say that's right? They're simply the
Robber Council of Ephesus already happened, and because the faithful know the faith, they knew to reject it.
See, again, I think that's pretty loose, pretty shaky stuff. But
that's an observation. I have to ask history. Do you not know about the Robber Council of Ephesus? That's not me making that up.
I have to ask you. I'm not saying you're making that up. I don't know if that logic is pretty sound in terms of you keep saying juridical, but I don't know if that's totally sound that we can rely on that. But I have to ask you before we proceed, because this is an important question. You throughout this debate you say things like, Catholics like to do this. Catholics generally do this. Catholics have that. You speak with sort of this derision for Catholics, or I don't know if it's a condescension or something. But I mean, you said yourself that you were a Catholic for 10 years. You were a Catholic, and then you were Orthodox, and then I guess you were Catholic after that. You renounced your Orthodoxy, and so how can you be so, I guess, condescending? How can you be so derisive towards Catholics if you yourself were not only a Catholic once, but also were an Orthodox and then came back to Catholicism? I mean, what happened after that? What made you reject Orthodoxy and then come back to Catholicism, then go back and then acquire this? I consider you as Orthodox as pretty close to the Catholic Church, and we have this alliance, I think, in a lot of ways as traditionalists against the modernists and Protestants, most definitely. But you seem to have this very, I don't know, kind of this hostility. Maybe I'm misreading it, but I mean, where does this come from? Why did you go from Orthodox to Catholic and back again? And then why the derision?
Okay, well, that's a nice little trick there to try to throw some shade.
There it is. There it is.
Throw some shade on my background, but I'll be glad to address that. So
first, it's no shade. I'm just wondering.
Well, I mean, can we also ask like every opinion you've had? I mean, have you had any changes of mind, or did you get it all figured out by age 19?
Wow, there it is again. You're a little bit defensive there, don't you think? I'm asking a pretty sincere question. I don't understand how somebody goes from Catholic to Orthodox and then back. I'm not asking that with any ill intent.
I mean, I don't have a problem addressing my past or background or anything like that. I talk about it frequently in interviews. So, but I don't think it's relevant to a debate on the objective issues. But I'll be glad to talk about it. I'll be glad to talk about it.
Okay, so let's hear.
So the first point I would say is, yes, 10 years ago when I was a Roman Catholic and I was interested in a monastic life and things like that, that's when I first got into Orthodoxy, and I had a lot of debates with Orthodox guys. I went to Roman Catholic apologists and had debates. I went to Dominicans and had debates. I actually dialogued with the Vatican's appointee for Eastern Affairs, who's actually the guy in charge of Eastern theology and liturgy. We had dialogue. I dialogued with Jim Lacautus, a lot of famous Roman Catholic apologists. So I spent about 2 years from about 2007, 8, 9, 10, where I was kind of really having a hard time with the Uniate position, with Roman Catholic position. I was very, very dedicated to Thomism, and I didn't want to give up that system of Thomism. But I was also confronted with a lot of people who were former Thomists and people who were very intellectual and very well studied in Orthodoxy. So yes, I absolutely had a crisis period, and I went back and forth for a long time. And so basically I took a little time and stepped back. I focused on movies, I focused on my grad work, and then came back to the theological issues, got involved in the church again. And that was probably, I don't know, 4 years ago. So it took me about, I would say, a period of about 10 years to really chew on this and to really work through it for me. So the derision, I think, is a response to a lot of the smack talking that a lot of Catholics will do, but they won't ever come on and debate. So that's the derision, is that it's not directed personally at you. I mean, I'm not mad at you. But I don't. I feel like I'm debating myself when I was like 20, and I'm not being a dickhead.
Okay, no, I was just wondering because. And I wasn't asking that like to like call you on the curb, like, oh, like you're not sincere. I was just wondering because I know you were a Catholic for a long time, so it was kind of weird. But I get that they don't debate. But yeah. Anyway, moving on.
One last point on that is that I think that for me, one of the other Trump arguments, Donald Trump arguments, will be the point that what was so hard for me ultimately was the documents and the teachings and the papal encyclicals after Vatican II. Now, ultimately, when I started reading a lot of the pre-Vatican II papal encyclicals, and I probably read 500 pages worth of those, I came away with just a constant inner struggle with how to try to reconcile the very clear statements in Vatican II, and you seem to say that the councils and the documents are clear. I felt that they were. I don't see how there's any possible way. And I've listened to all manner of Roman Catholic apologists trying to mesh and make sense of the documents of Vatican II, and how Nostra Aetate can say that we're united with the Zionists and with the Jews, and that Islam can also provide a way to heaven, and how that we don't need confessional Orthodox or Christian states anymore. So for me, there's so many things in Vatican II that are just so obviously a complete apostasy that I got to the point where I just could not defend it anymore. And in honesty, right? So for me, that's the end of the line. I mean, there's no way to accept the ecumenism of Vatican II. For example, the 28 encyclical of Pope Pius XI called Mortalium Animos. When you read down in that encyclical, and encyclicals in Roman Catholic theology are part of the ordinary magisterium, you can't reject them. Mm-hmm. In Mortalium Animos, he says that the kind of religious ecumenism where we're praying with all of the other religions, and we go into the mosque and pray like Benedict and Francis have done. When we go in the synagogue and we pray like Benedict and Francis and John Paul have done. When we do these actions, he says these are apostasy. He says this is an apostasy from the truth, and it teaches everybody indifferentism. Now, Roman Catholic canon law is very clear about what kinds of things constitute apostasy. In Roman Catholic moral theology and in canon law, it's a very specific sin, like schism or like heresy, that leads to certain conclusions, ipso facto, as it's called. So ipso facto excommunications in Roman Catholic theology result when a bishop or a layperson even does or teaches something explicitly heretical. For example, even the modern canon law will excommunicate a person who gets an abortion. And to be forgiven, technically, the bishop is supposed to be able to forgive the person upon confession and repentance and whatnot. So what I'm saying is that actually in canon law, it's the same thing for actions of apostasy. When we go to Aquinas and we look up in the moral theology is what constitutes apostasy. In the Summa, he says, if any Catholic were to pray at the tomb of Muhammad, that would be an action of apostasy. Apostasy as described in Alphonsus Liguori in his moral theology is very similar. He describes the kinds of actions that would be considered apostasy. So my point in all this is to say that traditional Catholic theology being so clear about what apostasy is, what schism is, what heresy is, there's no way that any honest person could follow John Paul, Paul VI, John the 23rd, any of these, especially Pope Francis, who just a couple weeks ago said we don't need confessional states anymore. That's not just errors; those are absolute total heresies. You can't go and pray in synagogues. That's actually in the canons of the ancient councils. That's heresy. Like you're out of the church if you do this. And so for me, those people obviously don't represent traditional Christianity. Nobody ever would have thought you could do this until the flowering of Vatican II. So for me, it's just a no-brainer that that's obviously not the office of Peter. That's not, Jesus didn't command me to go submit to a guy who goes in synagogues and prays, and who goes to the mosque and pray, and who prays with pagans, and who receives Hindu markings on his head and these Hindu rituals that he participates in. Those guys aren't Christian.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, and I certainly understand that. I get a lot of criticism for that on my show about Vatican II. And certainly there are a lot of things in there we're not wild about, especially the conduct of this Pope, even outside of the dogmatic stuff. I think what's most offensive is, just simply the conduct, like you said, the praying with the other people, and the washing of the African feet, and the political statements. But I think I think in many ways, that is a call for further faith in the church, and that we have to get the church through these things. This is the one holy Catholic apostolic church, and I think we got to commit to it. Certainly there have been times in the past where popes have done these kinds of things. There have been corrupt popes and popes that have sold indulgences and have tortured people.
That's not apostasy.
Yeah, but I mean, these are still things that, well, and who decides? Does Thomas Aquinas in an official role when he says that something is an apostasy? He says it's an apostasy to pray at the tomb of Muhammad. But if the church dogma says that that's not true, I mean, who do you defer to? Do you defer to Aquinas or do you defer to the church?
Which, in your view, is only the Pope. So, so no Pope could ever excommunicate a Pope unless a Pope excommunicated a Pope.
Yeah. Yeah, no one can excommunicate the Pope. No, I mean, I think
so in other words,
the Pope, not a Pope, the Pope.
So,
Right.
but that's what I'm saying is that how can you maintain papal infallibility if the guy who has this office is consistently doing not just sinful things? This is very clear in Roman Catholic.
What sinful things?
Like if he were like many of the Medicis and these kind of,
yeah, sure.
Like they had concubines and this kind of stuff.
Right. Yeah.
So that's in Roman Catholic theology. That doesn't automatically excommunicate you.
Right.
But canon law is very clear about ipso facto excommunications. And one of the things that does that is apostasy. And I'm saying, yes, actually in Roman Catholic moral theology, apostasy is pretty clearly laid out. Now you're going to say, well, but who nobody has the authority to excommunicate the Bishop of Rome. That's true. And that's why that whole thing doesn't make sense to me. Like, why would Jesus command that I have to submit to a guy, not just who has concubines? I mean, there have been plenty of Eastern Orthodox people who sin. We're not talking about just sin, but specifically in canon law, a very clear sin that is mentioned, by the way, in Mystici Corporis, and it's also mentioned in Leo XIII's encyclicals, where he talks about what apostasy is. So if you want specific papal definitions of what apostasy is, you can read Mystici Corporis and you can read Leo XIII's encyclicals, because he will define that apostasy, schism, and heresy are sins that automatically excommunicate a person from the body. And how can any man be a head of that which he is not a member?
I don't think that he is committing apostasies. I guess that's where it differentiates. I guess where it diverges. Well, I mean, how can a Christian participate in pagan rites and go to the synagogue? I think that's isn't that more of a diplomatic thing? I don't know if that qualifies as, again, I don't know if that invalidates papal infallibility, right? Are you saying it's infallible, or you just can't believe? Well, because the early canons excommunicate a person from praying in the synagogue. Yeah. Okay. And it's not that the building itself is bad or that the tables are evil. It's that the action itself signifies as a public act. Right. This is also distinguished in Roman Catholic moral theology: private actions, public actions, conscience, and so forth. So public acts by persons of authority carry much more weight and have much more significance. And that's why in Mortalium Animos, the papal encyclical from 1928 by Pius XI, when he says that these actions are apostasy, he says it's because they teach indifferentism. And we cannot, no Catholic, he says, can in any way allow this kind of a thing. Yeah, again, I don't think that qualifies as total apostasy if they're out there doing that. I think it's a far cry. It's a far cry between the Pope doing something which is a sin or an apostasy, and the Pope saying something which is putting something in dogma that is in error. People, I think but it doesn't have offensive. You don't have to say something in dogma to be excommunicated or to be in error. No, I understand that. But okay, but are you hearing that Pius XI calls it apostasy? Yeah, I am hearing that. I will. And now this Pope, I guess, is saying that it is an apostasy, right? In a de facto way, correct? If he's going out there and doing that. You don't believe in objective truth, so the Pope can actually determine. I'm not saying that. I'm not. Well, but the Pope didn't. But that was it put in dogma that's apostasy, or was that just what Pope? Just what he said. Papal encyclicals are considered ordinary magisterium, and it doesn't even have to be listed as dogma because everybody. It just doesn't sound legitimate to me. I mean, has anybody informed the Pope that he was committing an apostasy? I mean, are you the one that's taken issue with this? So anybody who has a basic sense of what the Bible teaches, the New Testament, what the way that the church operated for the first 1,000 years, there's no way that you could come away thinking
that I can go and participate in Hindu rites, and that I can have giant Assisi meetings with voodoo practitioners in the church, that I can cover the altar up where the Eucharist is to not offend the voodoo practitioners who are doing it in the church at Assisi 1. This is John Paul I, or John Paul II in 1986. There's no way nobody in it who's honest with themselves could ever justify that stuff as not being apostasy.
You see, this is a very flimsy standard. You're saying, oh well, there's no way you can read all this stuff.
Christianity, dude. This is the Ten Commandments.
I understand.
You shall have no other God.
You can have, and nobody could say that you read the New Testament and you believe that the Medici popes are doing the right thing, right? We believe that the popes.
I already explained that I'm not even talking about. By the way, no way would I accept the Avignon papacy, 3 different popes. That's crazy talk too. That's another thing we have to accept in Roman Catholicism, is like these guys living in giant palaces like this. No, Jesus didn't set Peter up to be the world emperor in a giant palace, to have a Vatican bank run by the Rothschilds since the 1700s. That's why Vatican II happened, by the way. That's why the papacy changed its position on usury, is because the Rothschilds are the Vatican bankers. This goes back to the Renaissance popes. Anyway, but again, I already made the distinction in Roman Catholic canon law between just sinning, mortal sins, and actions like schism, apostasy, and heresy.
Yeah, again, I just I don't know if I buy that. I don't think that's very credible. I mean, you're making it up. You're making it up. Yeah.
If you can't buy that, then there's a problem in the basics of Christianity for you, because the 10 Commandments say we can have no other gods.
Yeah, no, and when they go, so tell me, when they go and they pray in the synagogues, do they pray to other gods?
The way that the way that the councils, when they talk about forbidding praying in synagogues, it's not the point is not that.
Okay, but you said thou shalt have no other God. So you're arguing kind of two different things here, right? If you're saying, well, it's in the 10 Commandments, you're saying, oh, well, now it's not a matter of, well, it doesn't matter if they pray to the God, but only if they pray in the place of worship.
I'll make it clear. So when John Paul participates in like Hindu rites, that's other gods. Okay. So if you want to say that technically is the synagogue in some way still referencing God the Father, maybe you could make that argument. But actually on the stream last night, you were arguing that modern Pharisaic Judaism is not connected to the Old Testament.
Right.
Judaism.
Yeah, no, but I'm not making the argument that I'm making the argument that if he's observing a rite or a ritual, is that a form of worship to another God? Is he worshiping another God? You made the claim that this was against the 10 Commandments.
This is classic casuistry. This is where we're trying to say, well, I can bow before a Hindu god and receive the mark of the tilak on my head, and it's kind of, but if I direct my thoughts to Jesus, then the action that I'm doing is not really in obeisance to that God. No, this is crazy talk. You can't do that.
It just seems to me like a diplomatic thing. I think you're taking something which is the Pope
you think
as a statesman.
You need to read the New Testament if you think that participating in pagan rites is just diplomatic, because you have no conception of like basic Christianity here.
It seems diplomatic to me. It seems I disagree with it, but it seems diplomatic. I'm not saying I agree with
what does Paul say? Paul says you can't eat at the table of demons and sacrifice and participate in those rites and come to the communion.
What was the ritual that they participated in that you're referring to? I'm not familiar with this example.
Okay, John Paul has done, you can just look up John Paul's life, but he was involved in the tilak, I believe it's called. If I recall, this is a Hindu thing. Mm-hmm. But I mean, he's done this so many times, you can't even keep up with it.
Well, can you give me an example of one of the tilak? And what does that involve? What is that?
In that case, it was he received the mark of something on his head. No, it wasn't Ash Wednesday. I don't know all the pagan rites. I'm not an expert in all pagan rites. I know a lot about comparative religion, but again, it doesn't matter that he only did that one time with that religion. Like, he has continually participated in these. Again, Assisi. Look up 1986 Assisi. That's the most clear example of this indifferentism that is obviously night and day with what Mortalia Manimos, Pius XI talks about. But there's also plenty of other actions like this. I mean, there is, just because Islam names Allah, and just because Pharisaic Judaism still says that they worship Jehovah, you can't participate in their rites. It's long been Western and Eastern canon law that you can't do that. You can't go and pray in synagogues.
Yeah, and I would say I would disagree with that. But I don't know if that would be
How would you
grounds
disagree
to
with
say-
that? How do you disagree with
Would
that?
it, no, I mean, I would disagree with them going
Oh,
and participating in the rites. I would say that you're right on that they shouldn't be doing that. But it's a very different thing from saying, do you personally find it against the faith? Do you personally find it in a certain way, or does that completely disqualify and delegitimize the foundations of the entire church? You know, which I think those are two different things. So, well, I agree with you. I've not been
they're actions of apostasy according to 1928 papal writings, according to Pius X, Pacendi Dominici Gracious, Lamentabili San. I mean, I could give you a whole list.
Well, show me the dogmatic writing that says, and then show me the example where it says that this is an apostasy.
I just did.
Well, I mean, can you cite that for me?
Mortalium Animos is an entire encyclical written about this.
Okay, and what does it say? Is this dogma, and what does this say?
Papal encyclicals are ordinary magisterium.
Okay.
Ordinary magisterium.
Yes, and what does it say specifically?
The entire encyclical makes it very clear numerous times that it says specifically apostasy. These actions are indifferentism.
I find it hard to believe that, the Catholic Church has gone on.
That's your presuppositions.
What's that?
You find it hard to believe because that's your presupposition in the Roman.
Well, no, because I'm not familiar with the example, and I find it hard to believe that. And this is not like a swipe at you, but to say that like the Pope is out there committing apostasies according to the magisterium. He's out there committing apostasies, which I'm not familiar with this example. And the person who has an issue with it is not the cardinals or the bishops or the priests.
Well, there's an entire group called the Society of St. Pius X.
No, I'm familiar with them. Okay,
well, I mean, they've talked about it for 30 years.
Yeah, well, and this is not a significant. This is not a significant in terms of size or numbers separation, right?
I don't personally care about the Society of St. Pius X. I'm just saying that they're a group of a million.
You know what I'm saying here.
They're a group of a million people who talk about it all the time and have for 30 or 40 years.
Well, I'll have to look into this particular example, and we'll see if I'll look into this, and if I'm wrong, I will tweet about it. But if not, I'm not familiar with this, and I find it hard to believe, because if that's the case, then I will have to cast some aspersions. But
okay,
but we'll see.
Let me say that if you want like one book that really I think illustrates that, there's a book that TAN publishers, which is one of the larger traditional Catholic publishing houses. They publish a book called The Popes Against the Modern Errors. And really all it is just a collection of the key encyclicals of the last few hundred years. So it's only about 200-300 pages. And I would recommend that. And when you read that, I think you'll see that everything that I've said is 100% spot on.
All right. Well, I'll read that book and I'll get back to you. I'll post about it on Twitter.